Oat milk has rapidly become one of the most popular milk alternatives, particularly in the world of coffee. Here in Portland, there are a few shops that default to using it, and they don't even charge you extra. The various oat milking brands have to vie for turf, competing to lock down each coffee shop as a client. It's like the Coke versus Pepsi showdowns of the past, but a little creamier and a bit more environmentally conscious. So, how does one pick a side? Well, not all oat milks are made equal. When it comes to coffee, you have to weigh not just flavor, which is a huge factor on its own, but how the milk steams. With that in mind, I wanted to run a side-by-side taste test of a few popular oat milks to see how they hold up and decide which one comes out on top. For our trial, we've picked 4 widely available oat milks, each with its own army of fans. These 4 are Oatly, Califia Farms, Minor Figures, and Chobani. For each milk, I'll steam up 5 ounces to have as part of a cappuccino, and I'll also be adding 1 ounce of cold oat milk to an 8-ounce cup of filter coffee. Once we've got a good idea of how these milks hold up to steaming and how they taste with both espresso and filter coffee, I'll rank them from best to worst. Let's jump right into it with the crowd favorite, Oatly. First up, we have Oatly. As a little disclaimer, I have some experience with all of these milks, but I've never tried them side by side, and the Chobani I have not tried steamed yet, and it's the one I'm most suspicious of. But let's give this a little taste. It's definitely good. I've probably steamed the most with Oatly. It's a little bit more finicky than whole milk, but not by much, and it's pretty easy to get a nice, solid, emulsified foam out of it. The texture comes out really nice. It separates a little more quickly than a whole milk, but you know, we're not comparing to whole milk here. Definitely a little bit of that oaty flavor, but it's not enough to overwhelm the coffee. There are some oat milks where the oat flavor is just, it tastes like you're drinking liquid oatmeal with a little bit of coffee in it. Not ideal. Oatly finds a really nice balance where you're tasting it, but it's not so present that it's all you're thinking about. Overall, it blends with the shot pretty nicely. You're still getting the sort of rich, roasty notes of the Kickstep, mixing with the creaminess of the milk. There is a little bit of a slight bitterness that comes from Oatly. It's just on the back end, it's kind of in the middle of your tongue. I feel like most oat milks have some degree of this. It's not wholly unpleasant, but you know you're drinking oat milk. All in all, this is delicious and I have very few complaints. Oatly was my first favorite oat milk. They were one of the first to come to the US market and really push oat milk, and they did a really great job doing that. And even though there's been lots of development, lots of new and good oat milk, some of which we're about to try, Oatly still holds up really well, and it's still probably gonna be up there. I'm guessing it's gonna be in the top half. With the cappuccino out of the way, now let's try our filter coffee, still Kickstep, the blend that we keep in-house, with 1 ounce of the Oatly in it. Disclaimer, again, I don't usually drink my filter coffee with milk in it, unless it's not very good, or unless it's decaf. Not to judge decaf, but you know what I mean. But I do think Kickstep, being a slightly on the darker end of medium, blends pretty nicely with a little milk, so let's give it a go. It is good. I feel like at first, when you're having any given oat milk, most oat milks in coffee, it almost feels like it's the same as drinking it with some whole milk, or maybe some 2% milk. But then on the back end, you get a little bit of that dryness, not verging on bitterness, but dryness in the back of your mouth. And that's definitely there in this cup. But overall, because it doesn't have that overwhelming oat flavor, it balances pretty nicely with the coffee. It really doesn't feel that much different from drinking a cup of coffee with some 2% in it. You're still kind of smoothing over a lot of the flavors of the coffee. You're not getting as much detail when it comes to the notes, but it's a really nice balance of just that, that tiny bit of sort of fatty sweetness, and then that sort of slightly malty oat milk flavor, but really well balanced, mostly just inoffensive. It feels like coffee with milk. Next up, we have Califia Farms. This is generally another one of my favorite oat milks to work with. It has slightly less carbohydrates and protein. I don't know if it doesn't seem like it's enough to really impact how it steams, but neither of these have any kind of stabilizers or, like carrageenan or whatever in them. So I'm not sure if that has an impact, but it was a little nicer. The foam texture here when pouring felt a little bit more like whole milk. But let's give it a taste. It's balanced pretty nicely. I feel like it does have a little bit more of that malty oat flavor right up front. You're getting a little bit of, even though it has less carbohydrate, there's a little bit more of that sensation of sweetness on the front of the tongue than I feel like you get with Oatly. It's a sort of different character to the oat flavor of it, but it's a little bit more present, whereas the Oatly feels like it's a bit more hidden and you don't really notice it until afterwards. This is a little bit more apparent that you're drinking oat milk, but the texture is really nice. The actual foam on top feels a little bit closer to milk foam, but the texture when drinking it doesn't feel that much different from Oatly. Slightly better milk texture, but in my opinion, at the cost of having slightly more of that oaty flavor hitting you up front. But all in all, very tasty, and very few complaints. Now let's go over to our filter coffee. A quick note up front about the filter coffee. Some oat milks don't do any kind of weird coagulation business when they hit really hot coffee. Oatly did not. Califia does have a little bit of little coagulated protein bits, probably. It doesn't really, you're not gonna notice it when you're drinking it. It's not like it changes the flavor or anything like that, but you do notice little globules in your coffee, very small, but they are there. Is it off-putting? Maybe to the uninitiated, it might seem weird, but there's no issue with the milk fundamentally, so let's taste it. Despite the fact that the overall texture and weight of the cappuccino felt pretty much the same as the Oatly, I feel like this feels a lot lighter, a lot less creamy in a cup of filter coffee than the Oatly did. The oat flavor still isn't hitting you in the face. It seems almost like you're drinking some coffee with maybe some non-fat in it, but it just doesn't have quite the same mouthfeel that the Oatly did. Even though it's weird to me that it holds up really well as a cappuccino, almost identical to the Oatly, but in the cup of filter coffee, it just doesn't hit quite as well. If I were gonna be having some milk with my decaf, so far I would pick Oatly over this. Now we're on to minor figures, probably the most interesting branding of the bunch. Still deeply perplexed and confused by the meaning of the woman in the chicken suit and what that has to do with oat milk. But when it comes to steaming, I feel like this felt the thinnest in the pitcher, felt a little bit more watery. It definitely was my worst steam of the day. It has way less protein than the other two. I mean, they all have pretty low protein. Oatly has 3 grams, for instance. This has 1 gram per 1 cup serving, and less fat as well. But overall, the texture looks like it came out okay, even if the pour is not great. So let's give it a taste. Wow. I've definitely had minor figures at coffee shops before, but this is my first time steaming with it. And having it back to back with the other oat milks is really interesting. It hits your tongue very differently. I was worried that it would be too thin based on my first impressions with it, but it's actually balancing with the coffee really nicely. Out of the 3 so far, the minor figures is giving me the most coffee flavor up front. I feel like it's obstructing the least amount of the character of the coffee, which is really nice. This is way more coffee forward. This definitely feels, more on the sweet side and less on the creamy side, but I feel like the sweetness is almost somehow bringing the coffee forward a little bit more. The sort of tart notes of the coffee the acidity it somehow feels like it's being lifted a little bit more. It's not being drowned out as much, and the sweetness is kind of bringing it forward a little bit. It's really nice. I'm surprised how different that is. Definitely less creamy, but I feel like it melds with coffee just a little bit better. I'm trying to think about where I would put that in the final rankings, but we can come back to that in a second. Let's try it with filter coffee. The minor figures did not have any weird coagulations in the filter coffee. It just looks like a nice, slightly creamy cup of filter coffee, so let's give that a taste. The lack of, I think the reduced creaminess from the fats and proteins is having a really negative effect in drip coffee. It feels really thin. It does not feel very present. The sweetness is there, but that just sort of feels a little bit out of place as well. It's impressive how well it works as a cappuccino, considering that just as milk in coffee, just not really there in the way you want it to be. It's not really holding you. Or the coffee. Let's go to the next coffee. All right, last up we have the Chobani Extra Creamy Oat Milk. This one is notable for being the only one that is not trying to be steamed. It doesn't say that it's barista series or what have you. Steaming it certainly sounded like it didn't want to be steamed. Overall, in terms of the nutrition facts, it's pretty similar to the Califia Farms, just with 1 gram more protein, so 8 instead of 7. But it definitely did not have the same texture when steaming. Felt kind of thin, despite being quite creamy, but or quite fatty. But the definition I was able to get out of it was surprisingly good. Even though the texture felt off, the pour came out okay. So let's see how it tastes. It's not bad. Chobani is notable to me among oat milks for being the one that tastes least like oats. But it tastes not like oats to a degree that's almost kind of concerning. It doesn't really taste like anything at all, and it's almost like gray in color. It has a sort of like matrix nutrient paste quality to it that is a little bit unsettling. But sometimes having an oat milk that doesn't taste oaty is useful. In this context, it doesn't taste very oaty, but also probably partly due to that high fat protein content, it's really covering up basically all of the flavor of the coffee as well. Like, you get the sense that you're drinking something vaguely creamy. There's a maltiness there, and it's a little bit sweet, but there's almost no character coming through from the coffee, and there's very little being supplied by the oat milk as well. A little bit of bitterness on the back end. It's not objectionable. I'm not grossed out by it. But it's also just sort of, it's gonna be at the bottom of the list for milk steaming. Spoilers, but let's see how it is for some filter coffee as well. It didn't coagulate, for the record. It's not bad here. Because this is mostly filter coffee with just a bit of milk in it, the milk isn't as much of a presence. You're getting more of the coffee flavor, and the Chobani oat milk is not really like interrupting the coffee flavor in as big of a way. It feels somewhat creamy, but somehow not as substantial as some of the other milks that we've just tried. It's not bad, again, definitely less offensive than this, but it's not particularly great either. If you needed to, if it was what you had, and you really want some milk in your coffee, nothing wrong with it. But again, not the best choice here. It's an odd one. Coming away from this with a few surprises, but the one thing that is not surprising is that the Chobani, in terms of both milk steaming in a cappuccino and pouring it into filter coffee, is my last pick. It's not totally fair. Chobani didn't really ask to be here. It's not a barista milk. It's not trying to be, but it just doesn't work particularly well. I thought maybe the extra creaminess, that extra fat and protein would be the thing that maybe helped it work in both milk steaming and in drip coffee, and it just doesn't really work out all that well. I came into this thinking that higher protein and fat content would probably just be better overall. It's part of why I picked this. Obviously there was something wrong there, which is why I thought that the Oatly and the Califia Farms were gonna be the winners here. I do really like them, and I think that these two, they're almost on the level in terms of milk texture. I maybe have a slight preference for the Califia, but it's sort of hard to say. But in a cappuccino, smaller milk drink that's a little bit more focused on coffee flavor, I feel like the coffee flavors are coming through way more clearly with minor figures. If you were having a larger milk drink, a latte, or something that is not really as much about the coffee flavor, maybe you're using a really roasty dark coffee and maybe you're making a vanilla latte or something like that, I feel like these two could be the winners. But in terms of a coffee forward milk drink, I'm going with minor figures as my first place, just purely because the flavors come through so much nicer. These two are sort of tied for second and third. If I had to pick, I'd put Califia Farms in second, Oatly in third. It's very tight, and that could change, you know, day by day, I think, but Chobani, dead last. In terms of pouring the milk into filter coffee, I feel like, again, because these are bringing a little bit more weight, a little bit more creaminess, it's sort of between the Califia Farms and the Oatly. I think it's a really nuanced difference. I might prefer Oatly, partly just because, I don't know, the coagulation thing throws me off a little bit. If you're serving coffee to someone and it's got a bunch of floating specks in it, they're maybe gonna be a little thrown off. I would probably rather have this in the fridge overall. So at the end of the day, top picks for a cappuccino, minor figures. For pouring into some drip coffee, the Oatly. Overall, I'm pretty surprised that this came out on top. Blew away some of my expectations, but it's really good stuff, even though it's got a little bird person on the front. As I'd suspected, each of these oat milks is bringing a slightly different list of pros, cons, and flavors to the table. While minor figures might have been my runaway favorite, I hope that this video helped you consider your oat options and made your cappuccinos just that much tastier. Or maybe it just solidified your love of the good old cow stuff. I can't blame you. For more espresso experiments, tap subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.